Next speaker in the session is me. Okay, so while we bring those slides up, I'll give you a brief introduction of how this started. Just for the purposes of background, I'm a scientific researcher with a background in pharmacology. Really, my core expertise is drug discovery, small molecules, and the like. I have experience in working on drug discovery for rare genetic disorders, and in one of the companies that I was working at, I had the pleasure of interacting with several patient groups because I was working on rare genetic diseases. And a lot of that work led to my appreciation for some of the difficulties that organizations face in trying to come up with research tools, in trying to move towards therapeutic discoveries. And it was to share some of this area expertise that I had that I got in touch with. I was introduced rather to the Association of Creatine Deficiencies, and I've been working as a scientific advisor for 3 years now. And that has led to an incredible learning opportunity for me. The registry was one of these efforts that was started last year, March 2021. And at the start, I knew nothing about a registry or what we can actually try to do. All I knew was we need to understand patients better. We need to understand the diversity in this community better. And so as part of that effort, we came to understand that there's a difference between GAMT and CTD patients. Patients and as well as caregivers have different perspectives on what's important in terms of resolution. If we were to move towards therapy, what it needs to be measured. How can you measure whether a therapeutic is actually effective or not? And it was this effort that led to this initial survey that we tried to put together. And I'm going to be talking about some of the data from the survey. Okay, so through the past 2 days, we've had a chance to appreciate what are outcomes. Just to recap that, outcomes enable us to look at the evidence that is generated during a clinical trial and to measure success in them, and to ensure that that outcomes are actually meaningful to both to drug makers as well as drug takers. And to arrive at suitable outcomes in a clinical trial, you have to make an effort to understand what is important to patients as well as families. I'm going to try to do this side. I also wanted, during the process of trying to come up with this, I had to learn the definition of outcome and then separate that from an endpoint. So here's what I learned. This is from the FDA website. An endpoint is basically that metric that is used to study a particular outcome and to analyze it statistically. So case in point, and there are many experts in the crowd, and I hope that they will correct me, but I think about it as, let's say you talk about seizure as an outcome. You might measure something else to, in the context of a clinical trial, there are measurements that you can use to dissect whether there is a reduction in a seizure, right? So is the frequency of a seizure reduced? Is the severity reduced? There are probably some of these that are more amenable to statistical measurements, and that is the endpoint associated with an outcome. So one effort of this work is to identify what is an appropriate outcome. A second effort that will take place later in the process is to see, are there specific endpoints associated with the outcome that are measurable in the context of a clinical trial. That is not what we are going to be talking about today. We're only going to be talking about the outcomes part of it. Okay. So as I mentioned at the start, Creatineinfo is the registry that is being managed by the Association for Creatine Deficiencies. It was initiated last year, and as of April, we had over 150 patients enrolled. We have 20 countries represented and 71 participants that have completed surveys and 13 surveys in active development. So for all of the people in the community that are on the registry, take a bow and give yourself a pat on the back and make a commitment that you're going to continue to be active on the registry, because this registry is something that helps us capture natural history data. You have to go back on there and fill out surveys or on a regular basis so that we can capture longitudinal information. That is part of the goal of what we're trying to do here. Another aspect that I want to mention with respect to the registry is that every survey that's put on there is usually, we're establishing methodologies to make sure that what we put on there is robust and can survive longitudinal questioning. And to help us in this effort, we have a family advisory board that helps us look at questions, look at their wording, and see if it's appropriate. We have experts in the medical and scientific advisory board that help us identify things that are of interest from a clinical or academic perspective. And then, of course, we have our ACD community, parents and caregivers that really help us do this job. So all of the work that I'm going to be talking about and presenting over here, a big thanks to the community as well for participating in it. So one of the goals that, one of the questions that I had for the past 2 odd years, when I was working with the ACD was, what are the challenges for CTD and GAMT patients? Are these similar? If they're different, then how? I would read a paper, and papers I would talk about seizures. Seizures exist in both populations. I would read something about learning disabilities. That would also be mentioned for CTD as well as GAMT patients. And then there were behavioral difficulties and the like. So how are these different, if at all, between CTD and GAMT? And which of these outcomes are important for resolution? Do caregivers feel differently about resolving some of these relative to others? So in developing this survey, we looked at what was already published in literature, very small group really working on it. And then we further refined this upon consultation with family members. So we held calls with them, asked them about descriptive language, asked them to give us examples, and try to incorporate these in the survey questions itself. After developing a draft version of this, we also circulated it with our registry advisory board as well as our CARE consortium members. And CARE is our group that consists of industry and other stakeholders, and so their input was also really valuable. Once deployed on the registry, responders were asked to rate 24 outcomes that belong to different categories. It was a 5-point scale going from not at all important to critically important. At the end of the survey, responders were also asked to rank their top 5 outcomes in order of importance. And just to give you an example of how survey questions were drafted to capture the patient family perspective, you can see that we tried to give examples. What is highlighted in the box over there under speech and communication, we tried to underscore things that would resonate with the population that we were trying to reach out to. So these could be parents with older individuals. It could also be parents with really young individuals, young infants that are not yet developed speech, or perhaps they have some difficulties even in the early stage babbling and the like that you can associate it with early childhood development. And you can see on the top over here, is the ranking itself included not applicable at this time. And I mention this because when you look at the stats for the members who actually took the survey, I want you to keep this in mind, that it's not the same number of people who have responded on all the questions, because this option was there. For certain age groups, a certain outcome or question may not be applicable at a given time, and that's what they'll answer. So you'll see the numbers be variable for certain questions. And here are some overall categories that we grouped certain outcomes into. We tried very hard not to go into a category and then try to, the way the survey was drafted rather, was really to focus on these buckets of speech and communication or seizures and the like. And then sort of at the back end, we tried to group them into categories that made sense to us. Okay, So we had, at the time that this data was compiled, we had 71 responders in total. They consisted of 48 CTD families and 23 GAMT families. Um, and most of the respondents were parents of a registry participant. And what you can see here is the distribution of age groups associated with both CTD as well as GAMT. And I want you to note in particular that, we have very few participants in the younger age group for GAMT. So what I'm trying to illustrate over here by using this breakdown is that you may not, and I will not be presenting on age-related correlation of certain outcomes just because we don't have the statistical power to be able to do that. When you take into account the low number of respondents in every age group, and also take into account that at least some of these people elected the answer such as not applicable for this time, the number in any category goes down very, very, very low. And then you can't overmine that for some kind of statistical significance. So that's why we don't have very good age-related correlations. Okay. So what are some of the critical findings that are maybe that stood out in terms of differences or similarities between CTD and GAMT patient families? So we can see from this plot that both CTD and GAMT families rated cognitive outcomes as being really important by at least 75% of respondents. And I want to highlight that speech and communication were especially important for all of them. It's also important to note that somehow the impulsivity and executive function difficulties, you see a little bit of a difference between CTD and GAMT, where fewer proportion of GAMT families mark that as being important. Whereas overall, for other categories, both CTD and GAMT, all of them considered to be highly important. Next, when you look at neurological and sensory outcomes, seizure was rated as critically or very important by a really high proportion of CTD as well as GAMT patients. You have other difficulties as well, but seizure stands out as being important. Okay, moving on to fine or motor and related outcomes. This is where there was a range of variability for in these outcomes for CTD and GAMT patients, right? What stood out to me is that fine motor challenges, a higher proportion of GAMT patients or GAMT families registered fine motor challenges as being a really important or critical outcome. You can also see that there are a few, in terms of low muscle tone and the like, for some reason, a higher proportion of GAMT patients registered that as, or you can see some separation between GAMT and CTD patients over there. Now, to underscore maybe to some extent what Dr. Schulze was earlier saying, you have to take into account that some of these people are on supplements. GAMT patients and GAMT families may be on supplements. So there might be some outcomes that are just not as important to them relative to some others. Whereas in the case of CTD patients, it is important to also recognize that they don't have any treatments. And in the absence of any treatment, certain things might just be more important to them relative to other things, right? When you interpret these types of findings, it's important to develop an overall context of the population and really not look at them in isolation. Next, we looked at feeding, growth, and related outcomes. In general, there were a smaller proportion of patients that found this to be critically important relative to, say, other outcomes that we've seen. There's a little bit of evidence for higher ratings for respondents in the GAMT group relative to the CTD, and it's not entirely clear just yet why. Behavioral outcomes. There's a lot of variation among outcomes in this category. And again, keep in mind that the expectations from a heterogeneous population that is GAMT might be a little bit different relative to CTD. But overall, what stands out is that reduced independence in daily tasks and social interaction difficulties are of high importance to both these communities. Another finding, and it's very, very minor over here, is that aggressive behaviors and self-injury behaviors were often rated as important by respondents in the CTD group. So we're looking at this over here, these two over here. And you can see that there's a little bit of a difference between GAMT and CTD patient. Again, these types of findings have to be taken a little bit with a grain of salt because the number in each bar is so variable. And that's why it's, when you're looking at this data at leisure later, please keep in mind the number of respondents and how that might impact the interpretation that's made. So there were a lot of similarities in both of the groups with respect to the proportion of respondents listing outcomes in their top 5. So the way this question was presented is that they took all of the survey, and at the end, they were asked to re-rank all of these again. Like if they had to place any of these in their top 5 outcomes, what they'd like to be monitored, which would those ones be? And so you can see that speech and communication was most often in the top 5 for both groups and was particularly dominant for the respondents for the CTD group. Motor and feeding related outcomes were less often in the top 5 compared to like the cognitive and behavioral outcomes. Now that said, fine motor challenges were ranked highly in the GAMT group. So to summarize, these are very preliminary results from the PMO survey, and they suggest that speech, seizure, reduced independence in daily tasks are important to families with CTD and GAMT. There are some differences in between outcomes for CTD and GAMT, but further work in terms of surveying a larger group of people, perhaps across different age groups, will need to be done before we can understand the reason for that better. And ultimately, this type of work really will inform the approaches under the PCORI effort that we initiated this year that will integrate caregiver viewpoints as well as clinical expert viewpoints. And together, it's the hope that we will come up with a core outcome set that might be of utility in clinical trials for CCDS. And as has been discussed already, it's important to note that while we go through these efforts, very important efforts in identifying these outcomes, they may not all be measurable by available tools. But once you identify something, you can start working towards the effort of building tools to measure it and the subsequent validation studies that will enable us to study endpoints related to an outcome. And lastly, a huge part of this was informed by Dr. Beth Potter, who couldn't be here today. She has been an extremely valuable collaborator on this particular survey, as well as our other efforts on the registry, and really it wouldn't be possible to be able to look at this data without her help. Huge thanks also to the Family Advisory Board, our care members, and the ACD board and staff. I want to identify that, or especially mention Sophia Balog, who was our first registry coordinator in her efforts to develop the survey, and more recently Emily, who's doing the important work of developing additional surveys and carrying on this work. So I'll stop there and take questions with the caveat that I'm not an expert in this field. Someone will have to circulate a mic there.
This is really great. Thank you for sharing this. He thought. I know. You do have great questions, though, so I will go fast because your questions are terrific. I wondered, in your top 5, it didn't seem like independence skills was one of the options. And I'm glad that it was included in the behavioral concerns, but I wonder if there might be something missing there, because I bet the interest in fine motor problems and speech and communication, those are all independent skills, and skill development has been something that comes up in other ways. So I wonder where independent skills would go in that.
I think this is what happens when perhaps you have a non-expert trying to do this, right? But when we spoke to the families, it was rather than come up in the category, we did speak about independent skills, but we talked about it in the context of, well, dressing maybe yourself, or feeding yourself and the like, right? And what it came down to is that some of those difficulties might come because of those underlying fine motor skills and the like. So we wondered then if that was a better way to sort of phrase the question. So if you and apologies, like in this format, it's not easy to see the examples in each category. We designed the survey taking into account what the examples that families gave us, and it felt like, based on their description, this was the catch-all term that might be used to register some of those ideas.
I'm just curious what the ratio to male to female in the CTD respondents.
Should have thought of that. I don't have that number handy. I could ask Emily to maybe help me find that number later, but I don't have that off the top of my head.
So just a comment to that, just kind of similar to the GAMP patients that may be under treatment, the female CTD might skew some of that data because of the wide range of
yeah, absolutely.
I would comment on that, and many of the questions that have come up, that because of issues like you're looking at patients with no treatment, you're looking at patients on a different point in the path of treatment, and there are so many variables that this really becomes interesting when you start picking it apart and looking at, well, how does the meaningful outcome change as you look at the age? Because as the children get older, this becomes more important, and it's not important at all when they're young, and vice versa. And so it's kind of an endless data mine, and very, very interesting. Unfortunately, we're not going to have every data point ready to go today.
And I, coming just from a different field, right? When being in discovery, looking at pharmacology and the like, even calling something an outlier and eliminating it from further analysis, it requires a certain rationale or justification. Just given the number of respondents that we see here, if you're not seeing it weighted significantly one way or another, we may not have sufficient basis to do that isolation. I don't know if experts in the room necessarily agree with that, but empirically thinking, that's kind of what I think about.
So the thought of perspective, when you're talking about what you would choose, because I filled it out for our child, my husband might have a different perspective. So I think it would be interesting if you ask all caregivers to fill it out and see if they have a different perspective.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You're leading into our next presentation.
Okay, I think I'm officially off the hook. Thank you for the attention, and I'll invite Heidi to give us her perspectives and close out this talk.
I'm going to follow suit with Sangeetha because I am also not extremely tall and stand over here so I can see the screen. And they're working on my slides. So I am going to be discussing today the ACD vision for the future building off of the discussion that we had at our last virtual symposium, announcing our goals and our mission. And I'm also going to be discussing our our parents project, which is a PCORI-funded project to work towards a core outcome set for CTD and GAMT. So, all right, great. So first, though, I'm going to talk a little bit about patient advocacy groups and the ACD and why we're here and who we are and who are these people that are, thanks for inviting me and thanks for, whatever, and who are you guys and why are, what is this? So a wise person once told me that if you've seen one patient advocacy group, you've seen one. And I think as I tried to work on this presentation and what I really wanted to express to you, I think if you're doing it right, then that statement is very true. Because the way that we as board and staff members see our role in this great work that we're all here to accomplish is as one part of an association of creatine deficiencies. We are the board and staff, and we are facilitating activities that we believe are of importance. We're encouraging people. We're applying for grants. We're instigating a patient-focused development session with the FDA. We're getting the word out as much as we can, but we're a board and a staff, and for us to represent ourselves as the final say would be very inappropriate, not to mention that we don't do research. So the other portion of who the ACD is the people in this room and the people that we wish could have come today, are researchers and clinicians who take creative approaches to problems, who keep trying new things, who keep looking into new treatments, and who don't give up on our children, who genuinely have a concern and a desire to see this through with us, and who come to symposiums like this, who are members of our Scientific Medical Advisory Board and volunteer their time and energy to advise, and who share their findings with other researchers unselfishly, so that they are, rather than competing for themselves in their own glory, they're just making sure that, doesn't matter who gets there first, somebody's got to get these kids a treatment. The other part is the patient and the family. The patient's why we're here. And if we didn't have CCDS patients, we could all go home and we could all probably relax, but not have this great purpose in our lives that brings us together. And their families, who are the only ones who can advocate and really say, this is what's important to us and this is why. And I can tell you, it's not secondhand. It's my real experience. They're the only ones that can give a biosample and enable research in that way. They fundraise. We have a global ambassador program, and they're joining calls with us and listening to updates and then figuring out how to take these approaches and apply them in their hometowns and countries. And so I think that, when you hear about ACD, we don't want anyone to feel alienated. We don't want you to feel like this is an organization. We're talking about all of you, and we're always looking for feedback, collaboration, suggestions for improvement, and we hope that you end this symposium feeling like a partner in this process. So our vision is diagnosis at birth and effective treatments at birth. And to that point, we announced an ambitious 5-year goal that we would like to see in 5 years, 5 INDs, 5 countries with CCDS testing from birth. And we've talked about the RUSP and GAMT and the real potential there. And then $5 million in funding. So we're stepping it up in all ways possible. But like I said, it's a partnership, and everyone plays a role in these goals. We can't do it alone. So to support our vision, we feel like there's 3 main pillars and initiatives that fall under each of those. So discovery of research and such as our drug repurposing fellowships, the gene therapy awards that we've given out, and projects underway such as Dr. Lipschutz's project and others that we've heard from. The biosamples we've collected, this 25 is way out of date because I talked to the gentleman from Coriel and asked, you're going to have some people that go, never mind, I don't know what I was thinking. What's your usual percentage? And they said about 20% drop out. Last I talked, we've got 100%. We're committed and we're killing it. So if you look at other diseases and for how rare we are, we're all doing amazing. You're all doing amazing. And then along the lines of discovery as well, helping you all to connect for a cure, which was the theme of this conference. Today, in case some of you are curious, we had 29 speakers, 1 panel, 3 industry talks, 153 registered attendees. 22 of the families have a child affected with CTD and 7 with GAMT. And then diagnosis. We heard from probably genetic, and we're always talking about earlier diagnosis, and we're engaging in advocating for newborn screening and for research to go beyond just GAMT and improve genetic testing. And then lastly, building on what we know about the patients. So like we heard from Sangeetha, our registry is a powerful tool. We are engaging in the process of getting ICD-10 codes secured for all 3 creatine deficiencies so we can know a lot more about prevalence and potential centers of excellence and experienced clinicians that we haven't identified, et cetera, et cetera. And then our PCORI project. So now I'm gonna lead into that and I'll try to keep it brief, but and I'm wrapping it up here. We're gonna have a parent session afterwards that everyone is welcome to go to, but there's not a Q&A, but I'll say if you wanna have a long chat, come ask me about this project because I'm very excited. We've applied, I think we applied 6 times for a PCORI grant. They're very difficult to get, and we did finally get awarded a PCORI grant last year. And we kicked that off at the end of 2021. And I will give credit where it is due to Laura Trutoyu, who can't be here, but she is our principal investigator on this research project and really led the charge on applying for this. And I want to share the goals of this project with you. So first is to train parents to engage with research. This project is so exciting because it's going to allow us to accomplish so much, and it really touches on all of those groups I mentioned in the beginning. We recruited families. We have over 20 who have signed up to be on this project for about a year and a half and commit to go to regular meetings and have interviews. And a good part of them came on Saturday and participated in a focus group study, and they are in it. And in addition to the focus group, we have regular trainings, and we've talked with the families about what do you feel like you need to learn about to engage with research. And they had great feedback, like teach us how to read a research paper and how to identify news that we see come through for creatine that is legit and is not legitimate, and teach us how to tell our story and how can it be impactful and quick. And so we've got a heavy schedule of trainings that we're going to do with these families, and they're going to be experts, and they are going to be ACD out in the field. They're going to do the work that we all need done because this project is going to prepare them. And then secondly, understand and share a core outcome set created by caregivers, patients, and clinicians. I'm going to touch on this briefly, but essentially, our project is gathering outcomes from research papers over the years and our patient meaningful outcomes survey in our current registry, as well as data from the previous registry, and then our focus group that happened on Saturday. And we're combining all of these potential outcomes into a very large Delphi survey. And the Delphi survey, and this is where it touches on all groups, it's not exclusive to this group of family members. It is going to be circulated amongst all caregivers. We hope everyone in every country will contribute to this so that the more participation, the more valid this data is. But they'll be able to enter the Delphi survey and select that they're a caregiver of a child with CTD, or GAMT, and then proceed to go through every outcome and rank it as important or not important, and a scale in between there. And then as well, this Delphi survey will go to every clinician we can identify. So we're going to be asking our entire community, who's your doctor? Do you have their email address? We're going to track them down. We're going to get as heavy participation as we can. And then when they enter the survey, they won't be selecting that they're CTD or GAMT. They get to rank each outcome, and they'll rank it in its importance to GAMT and its importance to CTD. And then we will definitely have at least one more round of the Delphi survey. Additionally, when people are taking the survey, they do have the opportunity to add an outcome that they didn't think of. So our meeting on Saturday was awesome. There were so many ideas. We had huge lists from all three of our breakouts, but I guarantee you're gonna start looking at that and going home now and being with your kids and realizing, you know, this really impacts us. This is really important. So it's going to be a bit of a long process, but as it should be, because we really want to get this right. And then ultimately we will have a consensus meeting next summer, and we will settle on core outcome sets. We'll look at the data and decide, does there need to be 2 separate outcome sets for CTD and GAMT, or is it one? We'll see, and we'll land on a core outcome set for both or each. And so lastly, grow our clinician and research network. So like I said, this is gonna give us a really good opportunity to reach out to all these clinicians and say, hey, you've been identified as having a patient or more with a creatine deficiency, getting them involved. And then something really cool that's gonna go on throughout the year is the parents in their meetings are going to do a case study on their child and present it to the group privately, and go through a very defined group of questions. And from that, we will create an anonymous case report on this child that won't be disclosed, but will be discussed on an expert call. And we'll have experts come. If you've ever been involved in an echo session, this is an echo-informed session. We're taking a little bit of a different approach to it, but we'll be studying cases, discussing cases, and the care. So we'll discuss, you know, this child diagnosed at 6 with CTD, has experienced these symptoms, has tried these treatments, has had success here, has failed here, and then have, you know, the experts in this room and others that choose to join us give their opinion. And we will record those sessions, and the families will be invited to attend anonymously and listen, but also the session will be recorded. And so we're creating an educational resource for other clinicians. So a new clinician in Nebraska who's never seen a patient with a creatine deficiency, and this happens all the time, we're constantly contacted. How can you help? I want to learn more. And instead of bombarding Dr. Longo and Dr. Schultze, we will say, well, here's some resources, and then we'll make a referral. But we're excited because we're going to have parents that feel more involved, more active, have more skills to engage, and have a community that's brought tighter. We're going to identify our community that we don't even know exists amongst these clinicians. And we just feel very fortunate to have this grant and all that it's going to provide. So, and like I said, the educational resource. So, another thing to note is we are going to be having an externally led patient-focused drug development session with the FDA, and that is a very community-focused event. So you will be either recruited to be a part of a panel, or you will be invited to attend virtually. This will all be virtual, but you'll be invited to attend, and there'll be polls that run during this so we can get a live response from everyone. And with other organizations, it's just been incredible to watch how theirs went and the interaction. And what happens at the end of one of these is that there's a voice of the patient report that is written up by someone that we employ to do this, and it's put on file with the FDA, and it's shared far and wide, and it's a resource, just one more way for us to make sure that there's not a misunderstanding about our disorders. Like one of the speakers talked about, you don't get to the end of a trial that is saying this endpoint that we measured that we thought was really important, it didn't come to pass, but well, we never even considered that this other thing was really important, and man, it's, improved 100%. So this is just, again, a way to make sure that we have adequate information and representation of the true experience of creatine deficiencies. So back to our board, I just want to thank our whole board. I volunteered almost 7 years with the ACD before I took the role of executive director at the beginning of this year. And I'll tell you, they work their day job, they take care of their kids with creatine deficiencies, and they do this in every other spare moment they have. They're hardworking, and they deserve a round of applause. So. And then back to our community, who we wouldn't be here without. If you want to get involved, I hope that first slide gave you some ideas and helped you not feel alone, but helped you go, we really are part of this. And if you aren't doing some of those things and you want to, great. And if you don't have the bandwidth, we understand. We do what we can. And the next thing coming up is our Walk for Strength. If you don't have a team yet, get signed up. Because our t-shirt deadline is July 7th to get your shirts on time. And we hope to see you all walking and having teams. It's a big fundraiser to keep us going throughout the next year. And so we appreciate it if you do that. And I just want to, again, say, we're all here together because of our kids. That's why we're here. And thank you. So we're going to have a little break. We're going to have a coffee and social time until 4 o'clock. And then we are going to hear from Sarah Buchanan, who is a clinical director at an amazing school here in Utah, one of the country's best autism schools, Carmen B. Pingree. But everyone is welcome to stay for that as well. And then we'll see you tonight, 5:30 drinks, 6 o'clock, a lovely dinner, awesome awards, live bands. We're going to party.